evening, everyone, and welcome to the first ever virtual interaction with our Dean, Dr. Varun Nagaraj. So we've had 8 programs registered for today, and the span, from 1983 to the recently graduated 2021 alumni have registered and logged in and are logging in side by side from across the globe, which includes India, of course, US, Canada, Singapore, Dubai. As Professor Ratika mentioned, there are many alumni who have requested for the recording for this interaction. So this will be recorded and sent across. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Varun Nagaraj. Dr. Varun Nagaraj joined SPJIMR after a 30-year career in product innovation in Boston and Silicon Valley, during which he held CEO and other executive leadership roles at several venture-funded startups and public companies developing communications, computing, IoT, and AI products. Dr. Nagaraj graduated from IIT Bombay in electrical engineering and received a master's in computer engineering from North Carolina State University, an MBA from Boston University, and a PhD from Case Western Reserve University. Dr. Nagaraj has developed and taught graduate and undergraduate classes on digital transformation and product management at several US universities. His research has been published in international journals and conference proceedings and is featured in the upcoming 2021 Handbook of Digital Entrepreneurship. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Sheetal.
I would like to, and it's my pleasure to also introduce Professor Ratika Gore. We all know her, but here is the formal introduction. Professor Ratika Gore has 20 plus years of diverse experience in education and running businesses across 5 countries. An alumnus herself, she's now a core faculty at SPJIMR and teaches business communication, design thinking, and critical thinking. She's also the head of Alumni Relations, a doctoral scholar in IIM Lucknow. Her research has been accepted in a top-tier organizations internationally and nationally. She regularly writes articles in national publications, appears on industry panels, and is a consultant, coach, and advisor to an NGO and a startup. Welcome, ma'am.
Thank you. My God, I've never heard you given us more formal introduction. So thank you for that. So I'll take over from here, Sheetal. That was lovely. First of all, thank you so much for joining in today. It's, well, it is Saturday evening and you spending it with us. So for that, thank you. At least for the India time. And I know a lot of people from different time zones. So good afternoon, good evening, and perhaps little late good evening also. So what I'll do is in the next 1 hour, the first 30 minutes, I'll pose some questions to Dr. Nagaraj, which have been sent by you guys only, because as you know, in the registration form, we requested you for 1 question. So I looked at the question and there were typically 4 buckets I could see. One was about SP, second was about alumni, third was a little bit about understanding on what is management study going to be post-COVID. And the 4th bucket was a little bit of personal question. I think the assumption is to, or the attempt is to get to know Dr. Nagaraj a little bit better. And then after 30 minutes, we'll open it. And my request would be that, if you could put your question on the chat, and then I could, pick up and request that alumnus to unmute and ask the question. But we'll try and finish in 1 hour because I know time is precious for everyone. So on that note, first question, which again, like I said, I'm picking up from the questions asked by alumni today, is so Dr. Nagaraj, should I call you Varun or how would you prefer to be?
How about Varun Ratika? I think that sounds a little better.
All right. So Varun, most of the alumni right now are probably it's on top of their mind right now. What is your vision for SPJIMR, both short term and long term, in the sense what are immediate priority areas and what's the long term aspects of it? So if you could just shed some light on that.
Sure thing. Instead of giving sort of a linear timeline, let me do what business school faculty and students should do, which is start with a 2x2 matrix, right? So let's look at sort of our mission. I think we all know that, right? To influence practice, promote value-based growth. So let's build off of that. So the question really is, how do you influence practice? How does any business school influence practice? And there are really 2 ways in which it can influence practice, right? So that's the first dimension of our 2x2 that we're going to put out there. And the 2 ways on that are really around through teaching and through thought leadership. And most business school graduates, when they think of their alma mater, tend to think much more of the teaching component of it, right? They don't necessarily think about the thought leadership part of it, but I want to put it out there upfront in our 2x2. So we're looking at the x-axis, if you will, and on the x-axis, we're basically dropping two things there, teaching and thought leadership. Now, there's two things you want to look at under each of these. You want to basically look at how effective you are, in terms of teaching to the times, and I know some of the other questions are around that. And then how effective you are in terms of creating thought leadership, right? So that effectiveness is one aspect. And then the other one would be scale, right? Who are you trying to basically reach with both your teaching and your thought leadership? So we good? So we have a 2x2, right? So on the x-axis, we've basically got teaching and thought leadership. On the y-axis, we've got scale and effectiveness. So I'm really going to talk about these four things because the vision for the Institute is, I think, best described in a structured manner around where do we need to be in each of these four quadrants that arise from this 2x2 matrix, if you will. So let's focus on what's near and dear to the alumni, which is teaching, because that is how you experienced SPJIMR. So if we begin from a teaching point of view, let's talk about the effectiveness of teaching, and then we'll talk about the scale of teaching. So from a vision point of view, and this again ties into one of your latter questions, Ratika, the effectiveness of what we teach, what we train, what we cover has to keep changing with the times. And whether it is COVID exposed or, even pre-COVID exposed, if you will, there are a lot of trends and changes around us that require us to re-examine and refresh continuously what it is we teach, right? So to make sure that our teaching is effective, while we're extremely proud of the fact that we try and be current with industry trends, we're very proud of the non-classroom activities that many of you have gone through and which have left lasting impressions in your lives. The question is that enough? In order to continue to be effective in this newer world, which will be what most of you would call the VUCA world, right? Something that's volatile, that's uncertain, that's complex, and that's ambiguous, right? And all four words. For those of you who use it as a routine matter, of course, I won't berate the point, but for those of you who don't use it, they are actually fairly orthogonal dimensions, right? Uncertainty is different from ambiguity, for example. So in a VUCA world, which is much more upon us now in the last 5-10 years, and COVID highlighting it very starkly, there is a new set of skills that need to basically be part of the teaching curriculum in order for a graduate, of SPJIMR to be effective in basically dealing with this VUCA world. So from my vision point of view, the question is, what do we add to it? So where are we lacking right now? I don't think we have digital sufficiently driven into the curriculum. I don't think we have innovation and entrepreneurial thinking sufficiently driven into the curriculum. And I don't think we actually have a sustainability mindset sufficiently driven into the curriculum. We do lots of things very well. We have a social consciousness that's beautifully built in, second to none. We have international exposure and immersion that's built in, and that's very good. Could be tweaked, but that's very good. But these notions of sort of digital entrepreneurship, innovation, sustainability, these are, I think, the new mindsets and skills that students are going to increasingly need in order to deal with the VUCA world. I also think that there are a new set of professions that have emerged in this VUCA world, that our curriculum could be far better aligned to move towards those professions. For example, product management would be one. Within business development, ecosystem partnership management would be one. They don't align with specifically things we teach today. The question is, how do we change our curriculum in order to address that? So that is one big area, right? The effectiveness of teaching. And I think, Ratika, I'm probably covering some follow-on questions you might have on these as well while I do that. So I'll give a long answer, but I hope I'm answering many questions in the process, right? The second part of it is scale of teaching. The question, we currently have a few programs, right? The PGDM being obviously one that many of you went to, but we have folks from the PGPM program like Nikunj, as Ratika pointed out, and others. Now the question is that enough, right? If you truly want to influence practice, what should our scale ambitions be? And what can we in fact do, with the new technologies that COVID has forced us to adopt, if you will? So I'll give you some potential examples of what we're considering. So in the executive management space, we have an executive MBA. We do management development programs, that are either open or they're for a specific middle management sort of folks for a particular company. But what about other stuff? I was talking to Debjani, who is, one of our own, who runs NASCOM. And one of her key points was you have lakhs of graduates coming out of engineering schools every year who are fundamentally unemployable. And why are they unemployable, right? They're unemployable because their problem-solving skills are deficient. They've basically learned how to study and take exams, right? Their communication skills are deficient. Teamwork has never been emphasized, and so on. So, you can look at it and say, is there a finishing school opportunity, if you want to call it that, for a whole bunch of these new graduates? Now, Infosys has a whole town or a whole part of Mysore where they take thousands of these college graduates every year and essentially put them through a finishing school. But what about the companies that take 20, 50 new graduates a year? Is there an opportunity, for example, to extend into that and basically provide a program that's targeted towards them? So again, I'm not saying this is necessarily a good idea or a bad idea. I'm just talking to you about the kinds of things that potentially become possible when you begin to think more expansively about what scale you want to achieve. Yes, you can definitely increase the number of seats in the PGDM program and so on. But if you're trying to get to 10x the number of people, what is the best way to get to 10x the number of people? So what you're going to see, therefore, coming out of our strategic planning process, which we're through right now, every new executive has to come in and start a strategic planning process, and so have I, in collaboration with all the faculty. The outputs of that should be rolling out for 4 months, 6 months from now. But what you're going to see, therefore, on the teaching front is an emphasis on some new areas that we don't have, i.e. the effectiveness. And you're going to see us actually redefine certain programs or add certain programs in order to increase the scale of the number of people we touch. At any given time today, we have maybe 1,200 folks or so that we're engaged with per year. That number should be 10,000 or 12,000 or even bigger over time. So how do we get there would be the second part of the teaching effectiveness. Let me then talk about remember, we have a 2x2. I've covered 2 of the quadrants of the 4 quadrants. So the ones that remain basically are really around the idea of thought leadership. And here again, the notion of effective thought leadership and scale thought leadership. This was a little more unfamiliar, perhaps, to a lot of our graduates, because this is not something you think about on a daily basis. You think of SPJIMR, you think of your professors, you think of them as teachers, responsible for getting you good placements, and then moving on, right? But the point is there is a whole second life, if you will, that all faculty members have, which is around producing thought leadership. Now, what is thought leadership? Thought leadership basically is sort of an accumulated set of knowledge that could be original or that could be packaged, but that is presented in a manner that is acted upon by a larger group of people. So you're not trying to create these for your students. You're trying to create these for larger groups. You're trying to create it for public policy forums. You're trying to create it for other faculty members or other researchers. Consulting would be sort of part of that. These are all ways of sort of taking ideas, creating new knowledge, and making sure that they get disseminated in a broad manner. So here, now you're competing with, obviously, hundreds of extremely good business schools who are all competing to put thought leadership out. You have think tanks that basically are there in order to put thought leadership out. So the key here really for SPJIMR is to figure out from an effectiveness and scale point of view, this is not one of us scaling. We're not big enough to be producing thought leadership in every single dimension. We have to be selective about what we are collectively creating thought leadership around. Now, remember the notion of academic freedom. Any faculty member can write and create intellectual contributions on anything they want. That is what academic freedom is. So if Ratika decides to study how the Aborigines in Australia are underrepresented on the cricket team in Australia, she should do so. I mean, that is what intellectual freedom is. But that is not part of thought leadership, right? So that would be Ratika's charter, and she's absolutely welcome to do so. But I would challenge her to contribute to the thought leadership also. So where do we think we can create thought leadership? So I think there are sort of 4 areas in which we can create thought leadership where there is a unique SPJIMR focus. And this is an area of development for us, if you will, meaning we're not very strong at it at this point. In the financial sector, I think there are enough new emerging and unknown opportunities around what does ESG really mean for finance. I was speaking with a director from SEBI, and even though they have issued regulations to corporations saying, you've got to apply an ESG framework, nobody knows what it is, right? People are just throwing these words around like they know what it is, and everyone's giving gyan to the other person. But honestly, the actual knowledge of level of knowledge is pretty limited, as even admitted by the SEBI director I was speaking with yesterday, right? So essentially figuring out how would you basically calculate the financial impacts of ESG regulations or ESG actions is a rich area that I think our financial studies group can focus on. Where does fintech fit in? And again, you put the SPJIMR lens that we all use all the time. How can fintech make finance more inclusive? How can it make the economy more inclusive, right? So now you're basically looking at an emerging trend and its intersection with sort of social concerns, which is very much an SPJIMR thing, to identify that thought area, right? So that's sort of one area around financial services. There's one area around wisdom and leadership, so the notion that we have always believed that knowledge can come from anywhere, whether you were part of the generation that went through the Gita Shabir, or whether you went through whether you went to the ashram or not, or you're a more contemporary person who went through a personal growth lab and a science of spirituality. Those are examples of SPJIMR recognizing that there is this thing called wisdom that goes beyond just, typical management efficiency, right? There's a soul, if you will, in management decision-making, and that's uniquely us. There is a research opportunity and a thought leadership opportunity around that, which we would call wisdom and leadership, that I hope that we can create some unique thought leadership on. And one that is extremely near and dear to my heart is around innovation for a purpose. So if you take a look at innovation for the 17 UN Sustainability Development Goals, right? I hope many of you are familiar with the fact that the United Nations put out sort of 17 goals, if you will. They call SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. And they are things that you and I would have no disagreements on, right? They're about trying to eradicate poverty, or they're about making sure women and minorities have the same rights that other folks do. It's about having water access and food access for all, and so forth. It's about making sure humans realize their potential. These are sort of 17 such goals. And the question is, what innovations can drive towards those goals? So when we talk of our entrepreneurial gap that we want to fill, I want to fill it in a way that is still SPJIMR aligned, if you will, from a thought leadership point of view. It's fine if our graduates go off and build a dating app that has zero, social value. That's perfectly fine. We are a business school after all. But from a thought leadership point of view, the kind of research we do in innovation and entrepreneurship, I would hope, is aligned with the kinds of things that are outlined in the SDG. And finally, the family business area is one where I think there's an opportunity to create thought leadership and do all kinds of interesting things there as well from a thought leadership point of view. So scale will be more limited in thought leadership, and we have to be very, very precise about these areas in order to be effective. So that then is your 2x2, if you will. And in each of these, obviously, there will be specific initiatives we would do in 2022, certain things in 2023, and so forth. But that's kind of the framing device. So rather than giving you a laundry list, I have 3 objectives and this is for next year. I wanted to share with you the logic behind it, the framework behind it, because frameworks stand a little longer than a linear laundry list. So, all right, Ratika, long answer, but you know that I tend to give long answers to questions.
No, thanks, Varun. Actually, it was such a wonderful thing to hear, because you've kind of kind of set up all the other questions which alumni are really keen to ask you. So I'll pick up from that. But first thing I want to say, I know very confidently, I'm speaking on behalf of all alumni. We always feel that SPJIMR, has a unique program, a curriculum where we are socially conscious, looking at things beyond numbers. I think first thing I want to say is it's very heartwarming to hear you, because you are talking about sustainability, you're talking about impact, you're talking about going beyond just teaching, but really looking at the new ways of impacting society. So first of all, thank you for that. Going back to your 2x2, you were talking about teaching and thought leadership. So let me come back to teaching first, right? You talked about, new knowledge, gaps, new roles coming in, how do we plug in? So there is one question which has come repeatedly from alumni, any thoughts on what kind of new courses you would be bringing in? I know you mentioned digital already. Anything more you want to elaborate there?
Okay, let me signal what we are introducing this year, because that way I can at least talk to you about what's coming out, and that's kind of what has been planned. So one good example would be in the PGPM program. In addition to the typical 4 specializations which we have, which one could argue may or may not necessarily represent 100% of the available market, we have added a 5th specialization for this year around analytics. So PGPM, students can come in and basically graduate with a concentration or a specialization in analytics, not necessarily, as opposed to supply chain or finance or marketing or IM, which have been the 4 traditional things that we've done. So I've looked at the course curriculum on that. So we've basically built 9 new courses in order to, deliver against that particular specialization. Half a dozen of them are foundational courses, and quite technical, if you will, because, we want folks going into that program to actually come out with the ability to do analytics, not just talk about analytics, right? And so that does require them to actually learn a bunch of relatively hands-on things on how to set up a neural network and, understand the difference between a convoluted neural network and a adversarial neural network and all those kinds of things that typically might have been part of a MS in analytics program or a master's in mathematics and statistics program. We've tried to basically bring into this program. But being a B school, we also have along with it, supply chain analytics, marketing analytics, product and customer clickstream analytics and so forth, so that the business applications of them are visible as well. So I would sort of present that as one example. And this definitely predates me, right? So I'm not going to take any credit for this. I will not take credit for anything. But just my point is, the previous group had the foresight to basically realize that this was essentially a new set of courses that were required. And in fact, a new specialization that I think is in tune with the times. So that would be one example, Ratika, of something that is already underway. But along with that, we're going to try out a few other things in the PGPM program as well, because to some extent, it's quicker to try it out there being a 1-year program. And then if it works, we can roll it into other things. So let's take product management. So currently we offer 1 class in product management out of the information management group, which is okay, but to me, it's problematic. Product management, I've never thought of it as an IT thing, right? Product management is a combination of it is the ultimate cross-functional job that there is, right? And to sort of say, therefore, product management to start from IM just to me doesn't really compute a whole lot. So how do you therefore create, let's call it a product management cluster, right? What kinds of classes, if you will, collectively would create a decent product manager over and beyond the 1 class? And can we sort of package those things together, right? So for example, product managers depend heavily on product-driven analytics. Product managers depend heavily on the ability to go in and get qualitative input, right? Those are marketing kinds of things, if you think about it, right? And we shouldn't therefore silo them the way we do. So in the PGPM program, we're actually looking at the notion of a cluster. We're looking at a product management cluster so that somebody can pick one of the specializations they want. But if their aspirational role is that to go and be a product manager, there would be actually a combination of 3 classes that we feel is a good foundational course. And one of them that we're going to be driving, Ratika, which will also address some of the entrepreneurial and innovation gaps that we have as quickly as possible, is to actually have an innovation lab. So the goal here would actually be to have a full credit course that is a companion course to the product management course, where the students through that entire term go build a product and basically launch it on Play Store, right? So you do not pass if your product doesn't end up on Play Store. So this would be the kind of thing that we would basically do, which means they would learn how to prototype using the various prototyping tools. It's easy to build an app these days with no code techniques. So we'll basically teach them that quickly. So that would be an example of something that gets folks thinking as a problem solver, as an entrepreneur, right? Or as an innovator, but gives them time to focus on just that, right? So no gyan giving from faculty. The faculty will be there to sort of, point them into the right tools and so on. It's really up to the students during the course of the term to go and build their product, and maybe with weekly touch points with the faculty. So that'll be something new that we're trying, Ratika. So those would be a couple of examples of sort of the things that hopefully end up enhancing our curriculum, but it's only the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more that I think we can do, but I have not yet, as you know, Ratika, you've got to have faculty members buy into these things as well. It's not like in my CEO days where I can drive things as, unilaterally. So I need faculty to teach a lot of these newer classes, and I'm working one-on-one with each of them, trying to show them the light, if you will, on new things that they could be doing that fits this notion of effective teaching.
So, well, that's again very interesting because in the space of second, which was the thought leadership, a lot of new knowledge has to be created. You're talking to the industry, seeing where the industry is going. So I'm just going to go to the next segment because we kind of covered ground here.
Okay.
Both in terms of, plugging into the industry better and, getting to thought leadership, you will obviously lean on alumni who are in the industry, right? So I think there are some questions in this bucket which kind of came from alumni. How do you see alumni involvement in SPJIMR going forward?
Sure thing. And I'll actually also touch on the teaching part just a little bit as well, to answer the question of alumni involvement. Uh, in the teaching part, we do have our alumni selectively involved. They may be looking at curriculum, but it depends a lot on faculty members knowing them, reaching out to them, getting their input and so on, right? So it's a little bit on an ad hoc-ish basis. If you're a alumni and you wanted to contribute towards the analytics, let's say you're an analytics professional right now, and you're intrigued by what I'm saying, and you sort of say, I wonder what 6 classes constitute the core, right? Why don't I reach out to the faculty member that has put this program together and maybe offer, my opinion on whether those would meet the needs of my employer or not, right? How would you do that? So right now, even on the teaching side, where we tend to use people potentially for curriculum inputs, where we do use them, we just don't use them at scale. How do we go about basically getting them? How do we include a alum in for 30 minutes, because now the world is comfortable with Zoom. How do we bring an alum in for 30 minutes into a particular class where there is a case being discussed or something being done where that alum happens to be, in fact, maybe the world's leading authority for all we know on that particular course, right? So even within the teaching, Ratika, I think we have to figure out some sort of a platform way of engaging with the alumni where these kinds of opportunities are out there and visible for the alumni to respond to. And so let's take a look at your portal, for example, right? And I'm not saying this is how one would design it, but as an illustration, let's say there was actually a section on the portal called Faculty Asks, right? And these are basically faculty requests coming in, maybe once a week or whatever, right? That basically say, hey guys, here's kind of what I'm looking for. I'm looking for 2 people to basically comment on a particular course, or I'm looking for someone who's available next Wednesday to talk about how, Flipkart views its competition with Amazon, because that's what we're going to be discussing in class. This would be a wonderful high bandwidth way for the faculty and, the school, institute, and the alumni to engage with each other on substantive grounds, right? And these could be 30-minute commitments, half an hour commitments, and so on. Interviews, of course, is another thing that I know a lot of faculty participate in. A lot of alumni participate in, and I think we should increase that. Other schools use alumni a lot more than we do in the interview process also. So I think these are on the teaching side itself. We're doing these things. I think we can do more of them. On the thought leadership side, where you're trying to basically build out sort of a new body of work, you need data sets, you need problem statements, or what, in the research world would be called a POP, problem of practice, right? And where do problems of practice come from, right? They basically come from practitioners. So, identifying the problems of practice, identifying the data sets that might be necessary, putting together the cross-functional industry forums. So let's say you're trying to come up with a policy paper on something, and that's a combination of policymakers and industry people and government and so forth. Bringing that particular group together would be another thing, that I think alumni can help with. But I think what we need is a structured platform, Ratika, and this could be a very good 2022 type of project to improve the level of engagement, but around these concrete asks, that don't take a whole lot of time. So that would be my vision for involving the alumni further in a substantive manner.
Okay. So we understand that, alumni can just show up and help us with their knowledge and new skills. Is there any other way? I know many of them come for placement and placement preparation, and but many alumni reach out to us, at least in the 2.5 years that I've been in this role. How can we contribute? Any thoughts on that? How else can alumni contribute?
Sure thing. So besides time and talent, which is what we talked about so far, and contacts, if you will, definitely resources, financial resources is absolutely a way in which I hope that the alumni will consider helping the institute as well. And it's a fairly common thing these days, right? Across all universities, alumni essentially writing checks around specific projects, or sometimes in a more general way, is commonplace. So I think there are actually 3 areas within SPJIMR that I think are ripe for alumni support, if you will, financially. And I think these 3 hopefully, strike the right chord. So let me just walk through them. I think one is around scholarships. SPJIMR already actually has a pretty decent scholarship program around merit come means, where nearly 10% of our students do get either partial or full tuition assistance, as they come in, which is great. In a perfect, but it's still sort of capped, if you will, right? In a perfect world, we would want to be what's called need blind, right? What is needs blind? Need blind really means that you admit a person in without any regard to their financial ability to pay or not pay. You create your class, and then you look at the composition of the class. And let us say half the class, has studied extremely hard, but they happen to come from families with less than 15 lakhs a year of income, let's say. And it's 50% of the class. Schools in the US that have a needs blind policy will basically pick up the tab for that 50% of the class, right? So they're not capped necessarily by how many how many scholarships they have. They simply say, if there is a need, you basically get it. And 1 year it might be that everybody only from a wealthy family was able to clear the cat and come in or whatever, right? In which case you don't basically use up your monies for that. But all that means is you don't tend to think of it as a number. You tend to think of it as a needs-based. Sort of increasing the number of scholarships from the 10%. And the math I haven't yet done, Ratika, is I haven't figured out, were there others we had to turn away, right? Because they didn't meet the cutoff in some manner or the other, right? Or we had some sort of a limited numbers to play with. But that would be one area, right? A scholarship fund that basically goes to deserving students. By the way, many of you may or may not know that one of our master's programs is around a PGPDM. It's for development management. So it's meant for leaders of NGOs and for folks who are into the CSR aspect. We subsidize that tuition quite a bit, right? And we therefore lose money on that particular program because a lot of the NGO folks are not able to afford, and nor will they be able to take a loan because they're not going to go back to a job that allows them to pay it back. So therefore we just reduce the tuition. On the other hand, let's say you had a standard price for the tuition. You could basically have scholarships going to these folks who are coming into the PGDM program. So they write 50,000 rupees, and then the scholarship is 4.5 lakhs or something, right? For a total of 5 lakhs. So there are other opportunities as well, right? So it's not just PGDM and PGPM, but I think we should look at sort of the holistic package of scholarships and how do we basically make sure the best people get the education they need and deserve. So that's one area where I think funds would definitely be valuable. It goes straight to the student. A second area, which is also very student-centric.
So
yes,
we've had in the past alumni contributing towards scholarship, and the sentiment which says that, the institute helped me set up in life, let me help somebody else. So it kind of, goes very well in the sentiment which I see in alumni. So thank you for that. Yeah.
So that I think is a good one. The second one, which is also student-centric, is a recreation center. I'm sure most of you wish that you had more things to do on campus when you're on campus, right? And having a rec center, whether it is, for foosball, whether it is just to hang out as a group, I think is a good thing. So we are in the process of, building a rec center. It will be up and live in a few years from now. But having a rec center that an alumni choose to fund would be good. We would recognize the alumni with the donor wall, right? So, you're memorialized, if you will, as having contributed to the rec center. Whatever contribution you choose to make, we'll have that in the right buckets and so on. So that would be a second area, right? So the first two areas, I hope, strike an emotional chord, because they are who you are, and they are what I think you would wish, for the next generation of students that come after you. The third one is around thought leadership. As I said, we have a long ways to go to close that gap in thought leadership. Now, why does that matter? Let me just point that out. Thought leadership increasingly, regardless of the fact that it is a good thing to do, right? That's why it's in my 2x2, right? Regardless of the fact, our ranking depends on how the outside world perceives our thought leadership. So when we get certain rankings where we rank high and certain rankings where we rank a little bit lower, you ask, well, how did we end up with two different places? It's because the criteria used are different on the different ranking systems. And increasingly, more and more of the ranking systems are looking at what they would call research output, but what they mean is thought leadership, right? High quality research output coming out from the faculty of that particular business school. And not having high quality thought leadership will impact our ranking. and our ranking being impacted, I think is very material to all of us, right? I mean, we all want to be associated with, so that when we are looking for our next role and our next gig, it's easy to say we are undisputedly the #1 private business school in India, right? That's what I want all of us to be able to say. But if the rankings emphasize thought leadership and research, and that is an area of concern for me, my concern would be that our rankings would potentially slip if we don't have enough high quality research / thought leadership out there. Research and thought leadership does require a certain financial support, right? And there's no revenue coming in, unlike teaching where there's some tuition coming in. The research side, it's a cost center, right? It's a cost center that needs to be funded typically by operating cash flows or through an endowment or through donor support, from alumni or other sources. So I think this area of thought leadership is a good one. And the structure we're going to use is we're going to sort of coalesce our thought leadership into 4 centers. So the idea would be that when you are funding thought leadership, that thought leadership is going into the Center for Wisdom and Leadership, or is going into the Center for Innovation for Sustainable Development. And it'll be my role to make sure that the funds go in to do that. And it might be to hold a conference, right? It might be to basically put together a forum to have a working session. All of those are sort of the kinds of expenses that are associated with thought leadership. So not that emotional, but I'm appealing to your intellectual side here, and also to your very practical economic side, because a good ranking is going to be dependent on high quality thought leadership, more and more so going forward, not just on teaching excellence.
Okay. Thanks, Varun. So there were actually quite a few questions on what are your plans for increasing the ranking? I think we've kind of got an idea on that. The research and thought leadership would be one of the focus areas for you to improve ranking. So I won't get into that now. But I can see on the chat, 2 of my seniors of 96 batch are bantering with each other, talking about entrepreneurship. And that was a question which many alumni had asked. So just last question before I open the forum, I don't think I'll go into all my questions, what are your plans for creating and nurturing more entrepreneurs within the SPJIMR community, students and alumni all, and then we'll just open it from there.
So let's unpack that entrepreneurship thing and break it into 2 parts, right? One is sort of the provision of the right foundational skills and the attitude and the opportunities and the mindset, which is our job. We have to make sure that as our students leave our gates, that they're going out with a very clear idea of what it would take to be entrepreneurial, whether it's in a startup context or whether it is being entrepreneurial in a corporate context, right? Remember, entrepreneurship, it's called intrapreneurship, right? What it means is it's an ability to take risks confidently. It's an ability to deal with failure, which happens a lot. And having been in Silicon Valley, I'll tell you it happens more than successes by far. But it's an ability to sort of deal with failure in a mature fashion and move on, right? And not obsess about it. It's a willingness to make decisions with relatively little amounts of data. And it's a willingness to act with little resources, right? These are sort of the attributes of what the so-called entrepreneurial orientation, is. These are things we have to teach, right? And which means we have to provide the right kind of lab environment. We have to create the right kinds of meetups. We have to create the right kinds of structures for folks to learn entrepreneurship. We are not training them to be Babu managers. We have to train them to be risk-taking folks that get things done. So that's one part. That is totally on us. The second part, which I think sometimes gets conflated, is the following. The question is the notion of incubators and so on, right? So when we say SPJIMR alum have become great entrepreneurs, and I want to see that, as do you, when in their lives does that transition happen, right? So we have to train them to think entrepreneurially going out the door, right? With the confidence to do whatever it is they want to do. However, most folks come into the program today still with a relatively traditional mindset. They come in with sort of thinking CTC. They're sort of saying, I want to make my parents proud. The notion of what you'd call in San Francisco couch surfing, right? Which is you're going to take a big loan, you're going to come out of college, and you're going to tell your parents, I'm really not going to earn any money for the next 2 years. I'm going to go crash and eat pizza at my friend's house, and there's 8 of us piled into one small room, and we're going to be cranking out a new battery that does something. It's not yet quite here, right? So therefore, the notion that someone comes out of the PGDM program and says, I want to be an entrepreneur day one coming out of the PGDM program is slim. It could increase over time, but right now it's slim. How do we know it's slim? We actually have a program already that takes people like that, any PGDM student who wants to immediately go start a business, right? Immediately go or explore a business, has the ability to do so. We fund them to a certain extent already, right? They come back to the recruiting cycle later in case things don't work out. So you're giving them a soft landing. So those facilities exist today. And 1 out of 240 students takes it every year. One couple of years, nobody takes it, right? So therefore, the notion that somehow there are going to be these startups that come out at the end of a 2-year PGDM program, or worse, a 1-year PGPM program, I think is a bit unrealistic. It's a different matter if you're an engineering school. If you're an IIT Bombay, my alma mater, absolutely, you do 2 years at IIT, you know enough to go get a company going, you work with the incubator there, you drop out for a year. In Stanford, in fact, if you actually say you graduated, they look down on you, right? You know, you have to say you're a Stanford dropout. That's the only way you're going to get any respect there, right? But that's not the culture here. But in the engineering schools, I see that happening at IITs. I see the risk taking that those young folks have, and they don't care about couch surfing. So in an engineering context, it's reasonable to think of a 21-year-old coming out and getting a company started. I think for the SPJIMR group, if you look at it, and we were talking today to another alumni group today, Ratika, 3 years into their career, now everybody's sort of saying, how can I be the next Elon Musk, right? That's not the question they were asking when they graduated 3 years ago. And it was not because they didn't have the training, right? Even if they'd had the training, I think there are other pressures that would have had them go into their regular jobs, do very well in 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, and then go start something, right? And that's not a bad thing, by the way. You know, the more experience you have and maturity you have, the likelihood of your success is greater too. So I want to break the entrepreneurship thing into 2 parts. Absolutely, I want to make sure we have our students come out with an entrepreneurial mindset. But I think it is unrealistic to sort of say the day they come out of SPJIMR, they're starting the next Flipkart. I hope they do that 3-4 years after they've come out of SPJIMR.
Thanks, Varun. I think one question which has nothing to do with the fact that we share a surname, but the question was, can alumni get involved? Chetan, you want to ask that question on the angel investing?
Sure. So actually, to be fair, like one of my batchmates, I know Neil, for example, he's is a serial angel investor. And, there are quite a few people who I feel in our batch, actually, we also got Tarun, who's actually started UBS, right? And we've got a streak in our batch, which has got its fair weightage towards entrepreneurs. And many of us, I think, are now heading towards the gray hair age, where we would like to be intellectually stimulated. We want to put skin in the game, have an influence, etc., etc. So I think, so 2 things. One is, I sort of question, Varun, my guess is, if you look at the IMs and some of the graduates, so if you take all the startups and you find out their lineage, it's quite likely you're going to trace it back to IM A and IM C as compared to the other IMs or SPGen. So I think there's something which they're doing different, or in recruiting students who are more inclined to entrepreneurship. The second thing is, how can we try and potentially get another couple of students who are already gearing towards entrepreneurship and coach them along the way? So I just need these thoughts. I don't want to hijack this entire conversation. Might be a good idea that, our batch a few of us could meet with you separately and sort of share some of the thoughts. I believe Tulsi, you already mentioned that there's no thought in it, but we would love to share our thoughts.
So I'll talk about the gray hair part, because that I think is relevant to, not that I'm seeing a lot of gray hairs on the screen, but let's assume that, that lighting is making it look gray or whatever, right? So let's take a look at the fact that many of you are at a point where, you are in a position to participate in some fashion, right, in new ventures. So I want to sort of point out sort of 2 areas where I think you'll be able to do so. Remember, I talked about the thought leadership in the 4 areas. And I sort of said the idea is to have a center around each of those thought leadership areas. But within those, if you recall, the last 2 I mentioned was innovation in sustainable development and family managed business and entrepreneurship. So let's take a look at innovation and sustainable development. So amongst the programs we would have in there, as an example, Chetan, let's say we had the notion of the SPJIMR 20, right? So every year, SPJIMR with great fanfare rolls out its list of top 20 Series B or before startups. Okay, so I'm not talking about all these, crazy private equity money, right? Earlier startups. How do we do that? We have a committee where we basically go in and look at all the startups that are out there. We curate them, and we have our set of criteria. And our set of criteria is heavy points are going towards their impact that they're going to have on society, the impact that we think they will have on the environment, and so on, right? So that's the reason it's part of the SPJIMR 20, because it's part of the Center for Innovation and Sustainable Development. So in that process, imagine the faculty, imagine the role the alumni can play in curating, in selecting, and picking out who those 20 companies are, right? Now, and to do that, by the way, we're going to have 100 companies that are coming in and possibly pitching and sending things. An angel network, an SPJIMR angel network, then has, in many ways, first dibs on a lot of these companies, right? So that would be another way in which the SPJIMR community can participate. On the family managed business and entrepreneurship side as well, we're looking at sort of a fundraising platform, which again, from a family business point of view, you can imagine there are 3,000 family managed businesses, graduates that we have, many of who are looking for investment opportunities in other people's, family businesses, creating a platform for them as well as part of the, the Center for Family Managed Business and Entrepreneurship, right? So entrepreneurship is showing up in 2 of these centers, if you will. So those would be ways, Chetan, that I think we can involve the more seasoned alum. In terms of the numbers on the IIM thing, we'll talk offline, because I think the dirty secret of it that IIM A and C or B don't talk about is I saw the numbers of 70. All of them had a lineage to an IIT, right? Almost 90% of them an IIT lineage. So the fact that there's an IIM along the way, from my point of view, is like, who cares? Wouldn't have mattered, right? So there's another way of looking at it also. But we can have a separate discussion on that.
So that kind of takes care of the kind of questions I had. Entrepreneurship was a big one. There was this third bucket, which was about how management education may change. And Aditya, I think, seems to pick up the echoes that concern most alumni. Aditya Datar, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Sure, ma'am. My question. Hi, sir. Good evening.
Hi.
I'm from the PGPM 2010 batch. I wanted to know, how do you see the education model actually evolve versus a foundation 2-year MBA program versus, let's say, a PGPM kind of a program for more experience?
So I think learning is a continuous, lifelong process is the way we should come at it, right? It's not a discrete event that finishes after a PGPM and so forth. So I think the question we have to ask is, how do we stay relevant at every part of somebody's career cycle, right? And we don't today, Aditya, right? I mean, the fact is, to what degree do you rely on SPJIMR to continue to enhance your career today? Probably not a whole lot, right? So the question is, how do we basically take folks that have come out of our institute and make sure we're vested in their success throughout? And a couple of ideas are, and mind you, you should basically explore and pick up the best. If there's a faculty member who is just an amazing faculty member for valuations, and it happens to be some other institute and they're offering it on Coursera or whatever, you should do that, right? I mean, so by no means am I saying your ongoing education should be driven entirely by your alma mater, but we should play a role in that, right? By offering up the right kinds of things. So there, again, if we have focus in a few areas, right, then hopefully the best that's out there in a free open market comes from us. So that would be one, but in a more open context. In a more closed context, again, I'm hoping that we can create, in the case of alumni, a community that doesn't just share job postings with each other, but a sense of community and learning, which is a little bit more than what we currently have. Let's look at some ways. Could we, for example, have a 2-day thing every year? Call it a refresher boot camp, right? So Aditya, you graduated in 2010. The world has changed a lot. You've evolved a lot. You've learned obviously a bunch, way more, 100 times more than what you did going out the gate. But would you spend a couple of days to figure out, well, what is it that the SPJIMR faculty basically changed from 2020 to 2021, right? The newest and latest and greatest that the faculty thought was relevant for the graduating class, right? So if those things could be synthesized and packaged, it keeps you still connected with our pedagogy. You could also come back and say, that is total nonsense. Why are you wasting your time on that? But I'd hope that more often than not, there would be some value in the fact that you walk away with something, right? So and a lifelong engagement around learning is also one of the dimensions of this overall engagement platform that I want to build. We have a wonderful alumni group. However, the engagement metrics, if I were to put on my corporate hat, leave something to be desired. And so the question is, how do we basically improve the engagement metrics? It is to add more value, right? If there's more value, engagement is higher. I mean, that's one way to look at it as well. I can't just appeal to your, sentimentality as a way of being engaged. We have to give you opportunities that you benefit from, and ongoing engaged learning would be one of them, Aditya.
Thanks. I think some great ideas. I think even if online courses, like in the pandemic, there were online courses happening in SPJIMR, you could actually post some of the courses which could be very relevant for working individuals as well, right? And some of people come and participate, and for that matter, actually pay for those courses as well.
Okay, so when we started an hour back, there were 4 buckets I'd mentioned, right? One was about SP. We kind of covered everything around what kind of questions had come from alumni. Second was about alumni. What can they do? How can we engage? A few thoughts on that. And third was about how the education is changing. And the 4th bucket was some personal questions to Dr. Nagaraj, because there were a lot of curiosity there. So
don't flip to Dr. Nagaraj. Remember, we have a deal.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I realized one thing. When I talk about you, I say Dr. Nagaraj. When I address you, I say Varun. But point noted. So the one question which I think many of us were curious about, and when I say us, I mean alumni, is what brought you into academia from corporate?
Okay. So one thing is, I've always believed that a person's wealth should be measured by the richness of their experiences in life, right? So to me, once you have a certain hygiene factor or whatever of financial support, really, I think, your life is more interesting the more different and varied experiences that you have. I've always sort of followed that, even within sort of in my corporate context, if you will. But as part of that, I'm unfortunately a very long-term planner, and my life does consist of a bunch of 2x2s that get executed over 10 years. So one of those was the fact that I wanted to transition to academia in my 50s. And so that was something I began to plan, after I turned 40. So I got my first CEO role when I was 40. And I sort of at the same time sort of said, okay, what might I do in order to transition to academia, without a very clear idea of what that meant, right? Whether it was to go to a think tank like Brookings Institute, or a think tank around monetary policy, or whatever it was, right? Or whether it was to teach, I didn't know. But the intellectual life seemed like a good life to basically move into in your 50s. And you've teased me a few times, Ratika, for being a somewhat pretentious snob, intellectual snob, and fair criticism. I've always liked the intellectual life, is all I'm saying. So I began to plan towards that, and it required some planning. So I ended up sort of quitting work for several years to go do a PhD that I started when I turned 50. And I went to college exactly the same time that my daughter went to college, and that was, in fact, my wife tells me my long-term planning was so extremely annoying that when our daughter was born, right? So she's going to college, at the age of 18, right? So she's saying at the age of 32, when I held my daughter, I basically told my wife, I'm not letting this one go anywhere. When she goes to college, I'm going to college. So we went for our college visits together. She was, of course, petrified that I would end up going to the same school that she was going in and ruin all her fun. And luckily for her, she ended up going to Rice University. I ended up going to Case Western, but we actually went on our college campus tour together to Case, and of course that was at the bottom of her list because Dad was going there. But so that was the reason I made the switch to academia. The switch to India was a combination of the fact that again, from a life's experiences point of view, what could be a richer tapestry of experiences than doing what I'm doing now. The next startup gig in Silicon Valley would have been somewhat similar to what I had done before. This is totally different. So that's the reason for being here, besides, family issues about, mom getting old and wife being in India and that kind of thing.
So I've got some direct questions also. And one of them, even I would like to ask you. What made you come to SPJIMR specifically?
So that's a really good question, Ratika. And I think it was around the notion of, so I was looking particularly for a role where I could potentially lead and teach and do research, right? And it's very hard to do all three of these things in a larger US style university because you tend to do one or the other, right? Very rarely do you tend to do those, especially if you're doing a late career switch like I was doing. So in that sense, I will confess that the Indian business schools actually had a model that was easier fit for me in terms of being able to contribute on multiple dimensions. The thing I liked during my research process when I was doing my PhD, I talked a very passionate game about thought leadership, and I absolutely mean it. But I do want to clarify one aspect. Thought leadership can be done for the sake of thought leadership, right? I mean, but we are not in the business of physics, right? We are not trying to come up with string theory. We are not trying to figure out the secrets of the universe. Management is an applied art or an applied science. And sometimes a lot of business schools forget that on their research side, and they are essentially, it's called physics envy, right? Management professors want to feel they're as intellectual as physics professors, and therefore they go down a obscure path, which is methodologically very complicated, but the result is quite irrelevant to the practice of management. So SPJIMR, with its very clear notion that, our job is to influence practice, to me resonated a lot, right? So the notion of practice-focused research was what I picked up on during my 4 years, well before I had even thought of SPJIMR. But it matched very well with my ethos for what I think thought leadership should be. So I think the combination of those two things, drew me to SPJIMR. And plus there was the fortunate accident that I came by as a visiting lecturer for one class a couple of years ago, just before the COVID pandemic. So I had some familiarity with SPJIMR that way as well.
Good to know, Varun. So basically, there are two, points on our mission statement, which is influencing practice and value-based growth. And you seem to have covered both. They seem to be quite close to your heart, and that's very reassuring for alumni. I can say that. Gautaman, you wanted to ask your question. Can you unmute yourself? And this would be the last question because I'm very mindful of the time. Unless somebody wants to put another question, and then we'll just close at this. Yeah. Okay, Gautaman, please go.
Thank you, ma'am. So you did mention public policy earlier in your discussion, with respect to influencing practice. But generally, even within other Indian B schools and also in SPJIMR, the interface we've had with the government or with public policy has been very minimal. So do you see a lot of opportunities or potential in the near future for SPJIMR?
It's a good question, right? Universities in India seem to be a little less involved in government and public policy than universities in many other parts of the world. That is a structural thing, Gautama, right? That I can't quite change that. I mean, it is what it is, unfortunately. And a lot of universities that sort of get very aggressive also potentially get branded as activists, and Ashoka University being a good example of, someone that goes into the spotlight, but also the spotlight gets hot. So the question is, what can you do in a more apolitical fashion, right? And I think policy is sort of the way to look at it. So that's why, I hesitate to use the word government. I'm more comfortable with the notion of policy making, right? So, so within, for example, you heard me talk about SEBI. So that would be an example of a policy maker, right? There are policy makers that are looking at corporate bond funds and a bond market that would allow CSR funds to actually invest for a return potentially, right? There's a very interesting new models coming up there. Now, implementing that kind of innovation, then that is absolutely a financial innovation for sustainable development. That innovation is not going to happen without policymakers involved. Now, would I call it government? Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, the policymakers are executing on behalf of the government. But I think that's sort of the nuanced look at policy, Gautman, that we need to take, right? That this is about things that can therefore be rolled out, in public infrastructure in some manner. So that's what I would basically say. I would not sit and shout from the rooftops that we're going to become government activists or anything like
that. Thank you so much, Varun. It is 7:32, and I just want to say that, a lot of new ideas and new initiatives, I'm sure all of us are going to look forward to from SPJIMR, both in terms of newness and the scale, and very reassuring to see that, we're only going up and going in new directions and in a real way, not just for the sake of saying, but we see the intent is strong. So that's great. I would be very happy to close this session here. Thank you so much for coming, and wish you a very nice remaining of the weekend. Thank you.